Neha is the person who by far has cracked our CFP code the most. We usually have multiple high-scoring proposals from Neha that we then have to judge, which is really lovely. And this year was a little different. There was a proposal about cosplaying as an organization, and Gwen Diagram said, oh, that could be a really good keynote. And here we are. Thank you very much, Neha.
Do I need to, okay, right. Okay, I've lost my presentation. Let's see, where is it? There we go, awesome. As you can see, I'm longitudinally challenged, so you might not be able to see my face. I am going to need my notes, so I'm going to be standing here. I'd love a Q&A. Like, if we've got time for a Q&A, it'd be great to do a Q&A at the end, and then that's when I'll actually move into view for you folks. But listen, thank you so much, folks, for joining. It's been quite an intense couple of days, and for those of you who were at Mango's last night, and then the after party, if there was an after party to the after party, well done, honestly. Very impressed that you've made it this far. So I wanted to talk about when your company cosplays as your friend. So there used to be a time when companies would say that we were all collectively like a family. You know, you'd have cars and picnics, and they'd pay for your travel, home relocation. Over the years, I think we have a greater awareness generally that, yeah, companies do look after us, but generally it's not because of any benevolence. Like, we can have very kind, compassionate managers, but generally companies look after us because it's in their best interests. They keep us healthy. It keeps employee attrition low. It keeps in a very efficient business model. So having missions gives us purpose, which is great, but it's all about the intrinsic motivation, which makes us more productive and cheaper for the business to run as a whole. And while I'll be talking about companies, I am largely thinking about the private sector, but of course, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today applies to the public sector and the charity sector as well. I've been very lucky to work across all three sectors with incredible people, and actually it's the same patterns that we see. Some of the drives are a little bit different, the flavors are a little bit different, but it's the same economic realities that we all kind of work under. So the TLDR for this talk is capitalism, but I think that's not really particularly interesting. We all kind of know that. I think what is actually interesting is, despite knowing that, why do we still experience frustration? Why do we still not fully internalize what the nature of this relationship is between our company and ourselves? And what is it that we can actually do about that? Because we do have agency. There are things that we absolutely can do. So that's what I want to explore in our talk today. So I want to start with Dia's story. Dia is a very close friend of mine who lives in the US. She has been working out of Silicon Valley for 20 years, and she spent 12 years working at one of the most famous tech companies in the world. She had an incredible lifestyle. You know, she had 3 square meals cooked every day, including truffled eggs for breakfast. She didn't need a car because she was shuffled to and fro from work and from personal commitments, you know, through her company's transport system. She had her laundry taken care of, you know, and she got to travel around the world a lot and meet really interesting people. Travel was her soul food, and so this company enabled an incredible lifestyle for Dia. And then in 2023, almost 2 years ago, she lost her job. She was laid off, along with her whole department, as part of the 2023 layoffs. And this was particularly bad in the US, and she was really shocked. She was really taken aback because she was hardworking. She'd been working long hours, long days for years and years, and invested a lot of her personal time in keeping ahead of tech trends, doing research. She was really loyal. You know, not only had she invested 12 years, but she'd been headhunted a gazillion times, and she had still chosen to stay with her company. And when it came to her performance, she never had a single bad performance review. She was always exceeding expectations. And in fact, she was mentoring and building capability throughout this organization, you know, helping other data analysts grow in their role. And she was working in data, which, as we all know, is a high demand area. So she was doing all of these things, and yet she was retrenched. She lost the life that she knew. Also, quite critically, lost health insurance, and she had an elderly father. And for those of you who know the US, when it comes to your health insurance. She also lost her sense of identity because the tech company she was working for would open doors. Whenever you go for a drink, you're introducing yourself to people. As soon as you say you're from this company, you get social credit. So all of a sudden, she didn't have that. She not only wasn't working there, but she was unemployed. It was quite a shameful experience for her. And travel, which was her soul food, she couldn't afford to do that anymore. So she didn't have those invigorating things that would kind of keep her going. Now, my friend Thea has struggled with depression since she was retrenched. She is finding her way through it, though. Like, she's got an amazing support network, and she's trying to stay positive. She's found another job. She's kind of working through things as she's going through. Not everyone is that lucky, though. You know, Thea's story is not unique, and over the decades, I've in some ways been very lucky to work with incredibly kind, talented, hardworking people across industries. But no matter how kind, aware, hardworking my colleagues are, they have, no worries, they felt the same betrayal, the same feeling of disappointment and loss of identity that Thea has experienced. So what I want to talk about is, how do we get here? How do we end up in a situation where we've upheld our part of the bargain with our companies, and our companies have signaled that they do care for us, they have met a lot of our needs, and yet, at certain times, we've felt let down and even betrayed. And then because we do have agency, we absolutely have choices, some of us more than others, to be fair. What can we actually do about this? I want to make sure that we finish on a positive end. We're not going to leave this feeling in a slightly different way, with some active things that we can actually do as soon as we leave this room. So starting with how we got here. So I believe that we don't critically understand what our companies are, nor our relationship with them. Or at least we have varying degrees of awareness and understanding. So in my experience, a lot of us understand our companies and our relationship with them based on our lived experiences, conversations with partners and colleagues, or at forums like this, listening to talks at conferences. You know, these are the sorts of mechanisms through which we actually start to build a bit of an understanding of what our company actually is and our relationship with our company. But what most of us haven't done, and certainly I hadn't done until more recently, is read the Companies Act of 2006, for example. Study a business degree. Do a philosophical, economic, political, or material analysis of what a company fundamentally is. And I don't want to freak you out. It's not like we've just spent 2 days of boozing and listening to talks, and now I'm going to take you through a uni lecture. We are definitely not going to go through all of the nuances of what a company is, and from thought leadership, just so we can leave this room with a slightly more realistic understanding of what companies are. But first, let's start by looking at our company through our eyes, because that's our lived experience. So we all have needs. And I'd like to start by talking about our needs and how our companies meet our needs. So for that, we're going to use Maslow's hierarchy. Is there anybody who hasn't seen Maslow's hierarchy, or for whom this isn't quite so familiar? Okay, so ish. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about Maslow's hierarchy. It's a framework or a model that that was put together. I can't remember exactly when. It has been known to have flaws. So there are a whole range of human needs that have been observed in societies. But it's worth noting that, like all models, Maslow's hierarchy is, you could say, quote unquote, incorrect, but it is very useful. So yes, it represents all the different types of needs that we tend to have, from physiological needs for food, water, all the way through to self-actualization and self-transcendence, so needing to help others, express altruism. Now, there is no empirical basis for Maslow's hierarchy, which is to say that neither these needs nor the hierarchy have actually been consistently observed across societies. And in fact, observations from researchers have shown that the needs change across societies, And this is very much put together from a Western perspective. So there are cultures which are less individualistic than ours and are more communal. And in those collectivist societies, you wouldn't necessarily have or you wouldn't necessarily have self-actualization near the top. It's more about the well-being of the group rather than the well-being of the individual that supersedes and is more important. And this does imply caveats. Maslow's hierarchy is a really useful way about talking about our needs, and it's something that most of us are very familiar with. So we obviously have needs, and our companies are actually fantastic at meeting these needs. I've spoken about some of the examples in which Thea's company looked after her needs, but in addition to that, there are so many other ways in which companies meet our needs across the entire hierarchy. So from those physiological needs all the way through to self-transcendence. It is worth noticing, it's interesting worth noticing that in our industry, so when I say our industry, I'm kind of referring to tech workers, office tech workers, we talk a lot about our needs going from like the social level further up. You know, we might talk a little bit about safety when it comes to mental well-being, but apart from that, we tend to focus a lot more on self-esteem, self-actualization, and self-transcendence, and far less so about the physiological needs. And there's a reason for that, which we will talk about. But if we start at, like, let's say, the physiological needs, and harder in society, especially for people who are in their 40s like I am. We spend the prime periods of our fertile kind of life working. So we don't have a lot of time necessarily, you know, for recreation, for maybe, and certainly like because of the cost of living increasing, it's very hard for us to afford single family homes. You know, like generally it tends to be dual income families that are certainly in the West. And since 2014, in the tech industry, we've started to notice that companies like Facebook and Apple have started to introduce fertility services for employees. So, and as of 2024, so like 10 years later down the line, 42% of US companies are now offering fertility services, and that covers everything from egg freezing to IVF to genetic testing. So really fundamental enablers for people to have families. That's quite an incredible way in which companies are changing a lot of people's lives. And in the UK, that's also been observed. It's not quite at the same level of adoption, but that's also been observed as part of sort of health insurance and employee benefits packages. If we then look at safety, I wanted to talk about employment contracts. So I've definitely observed from having worked with a lot of people across different industries that there's a common belief amongst a lot of folks that it's safer being an employee than it is being a contractor, and in some ways that is correct. But it's quite interesting because a lot of people seem to believe that having an employment contract is the thing that gives them security, that gives them employment security. I see some shaking heads, very good. Your employment, whether you have a job, does not depend on your contract. It depends on budgets, external market factors, internal work politics, maybe even your performance. So all of the things that aren't even documented necessarily are the things that impact your employment security. Yet the contract somehow seems to give people a sense of comfort and security. So it's really worth knowing that kind of belief, that implicit belief a lot of people have, because it's maybe not entirely accurate. Then, as we start to move further up the hierarchy, if we think about, let's say, our social needs. So in our industry, we do a lot. We speak a lot about team identity and rituals and culture. So I won't cover that because you've probably been to a lot of talks, to be fair, over yesterday and today, covering those topics. What I did want to look at is the interest groups. So I think I've certainly noticed, like in the last even 15 years, there's been a real shift of bringing your whole self to work, whatever that means. It means different things to different people in different organizations. But it's about being more human at work. And I don't think I've been at a single client in the last 15 years where there hasn't been a Teams channel or a Slack channel that's entirely dedicated to dad jokes or entirely dedicated to cat memes. We're invited to bring ourselves to work, right? To have fun, to play, which is absolutely amazing. And our companies do enable that, Even in companies where there have been strict security policies, we've still been able to have fun. So that's obviously like a fantastic change that we've seen over the years. Another sort of way in which companies meet our needs is around leadership opportunities. So I'm a contractor, so I haven't been an employee for many, many years, but I have been given opportunities to be able to take product leadership roles. And there was a point when it was at the 20-year anniversary for my high school graduation when I was looking at the career achievements of all of the girls that I went to school with, which is obviously a very healthy exercise. And it made me realize that I was feeling really insecure about the fact that I was still a contractor, that I was still a consultant, Even though I felt like I had learned so much about the world and about myself, and that I had so much to offer, I still was reducing myself to a title. And I kind of felt like I needed to experience what it was like to actually have a senior title, to have that kind of responsibility. So I stepped outside of my comfort zone and I actually worked in a couple of different product leadership roles. And there was one role in particular where I was a product director and I was responsible for around 50 people. And it really hit me one day. I absolutely hated my job. Absolutely hated it. Like, I loved the fact that I was understanding how the broader business worked. I love that I was understanding the material constraints businesses work within because I was engaging with the execs a lot more, engaging with the board of directors, with investors. That was absolutely fascinating. And I loved growing my team, supporting them, protecting them, really giving them a platform to learn. But I hated the weight of responsibility. And this is despite the fact that I'd like to think I'm a relatively responsible person. The weight of responsibility of knowing that if I made incorrect decisions, I would impact my team members. They may lose their jobs. If they lost their jobs, that doesn't just impact them, it impacts all of their families, their entire livelihoods, like my friend Thea. And it was very hard for me to actually put that on the side. I was engaged with that every day, and it actually gave me a lot of anxiety. I also realized that even though we had a really strong leadership team, and my colleagues were absolutely amazing, we were very good at supporting each other, there were so many things we were not able to control or influence around the company culture, around budgets, around JFDIs. So as well-meaning as we were, and as much as we tried to practice all of the things that we preached to all of our clients, it was really hard. So I had to experience that to realize I did not want a title. I'm very comfortable saying I do not need the title anymore. But I had to experience it to kind of say, actually, my identity does not need to be tied in with a title. And I've worked with plenty of senior leaders who are still kind of stuck there. They feel like they can't walk away from the title because if they don't have it, what do they have? Again, it opens so many doors in society, having seniority and having that kind of credibility in an organization. Maybe another example to talk about is the 20% time. I think most of you are probably familiar with Google's 20% time. So we have a human need to be creative, to solve problems, to exercise mastery. We kind of know this. And Google, I think, most effectively popularized this idea that actually if you spent 20% of your time just pursuing problems that you were interested in, creative projects, it would keep you motivated. It would mean that you might find really interesting novel solutions to problems that were there, and companies like Google could monetize those, actually do really well. You are motivated, the company gets something out of it, so it's a win-win situation. And of course, the famous story is that Gmail emerged from that 20% time. And again, it's a great story, and I've worked with plenty of clients who try to do exactly the same thing. And I think Carrie and I were talking about this. It's great to look at that as a practice, but is that realistic in your environment? Because we work in plenty of organizations where people do not have autonomy over their time. So it's great to say you should be able to spend 20% of your time, but if your time keeps getting hijacked by other people and you are not empowered to say no, then what's the point of saying that you have the 20% time? It starts to be a tick box exercise and it starts to become performative. So, in summary, our companies are amazing at meeting many of our needs, even though there are challenges, as we've kind of spoken about. It's quite incredible that they've been able to help us in really fundamental ways, like helping us start families, all the way through to giving us a really strong sense of identity of who we are. And certainly for people like me, being able to learn so much, I'm incredibly grateful for those opportunities. And many of us can feel gratitude, loyalty, and indebted to our companies as a result of this. I found it quite interesting looking into some potential reasons for why we have this emotional connection and relationship with our companies. And there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about here. So there's a known phenomenon where we tend to anthropomorphize companies. We say things like, Google is listening. Tesla is visionary. Well, companies aren't a person. They are a collection of interests, goals, representatives, and so on. But referring to companies almost like a human is a bit of a shortcut, a cognitive shortcut, which makes it quite easy for us to talk about companies. But what it also does is it perhaps means that we start to have certain expectations of them the way that we would with a human. So for example, in sociology, there's a concept of mutuality. And this is the idea that, and there are various definitions, by the way, that there's a give and take, a reciprocity. If I do something for you, you feel like then doing something for me. It's that exchange. Companies do a lot for us. If a company helped me set up a family, holy crap, I would feel like I owe them a lot. There's also something called social exchange theory. You know, it's that we stay in relationships if they're perceived that, if it's perceived that the rewards outweigh the costs. So we continue to stay in some of these relationships with our companies because we feel like it still makes sense. There's still a bit of a give and take. But again, it's worth reminding ourselves, our companies are not humans. They don't have emotions, they don't have a conscience, they certainly don't have loyalty. What they have are goals, policies, and interests. And if, let's say, you were going through some financial hardship, you'd be able to crash on the couch of your friend. I suspect you'd probably get a warning if you decided to sleep under your desk at work, if that wasn't an option. You know, you don't have the same options with your company. There are policies around operational health and safety. Similarly, if you wanted to borrow money from a friend because you were going through that hardship, you don't necessarily have the same opportunities of trying to get advance pay via payroll through your company. Some companies might be able to do that if it's a small business, but generally it breaks the process and it breaks the systems. So companies are not people. They do not have the same flexibility in relationships that we have with humans. So if our companies aren't human and we can't expect the same social relations to apply to them, it's really important to understand what exactly are they and who are we to them. And this is where it would be good for us to now look at us through the eyes of our company, because we rarely get to do this. And this starts to get to the heart of the relationship. So companies are legal, economic, social, and political entities. They're all of these things. The legal definition of a company roughly comes from the Companies Act of 2006 here in the UK. In the US, it's based on various legislation across each of the states in the country. And they can vary quite a bit. Economically, companies organize resources, such as us, so we are resources. They organize resources to produce profits for shareholders. That is it. That's the economic entity of a company. Socially, companies are social constructs with cultures and internal dynamics. All of the stuff that we were talking about yesterday and today. And politically, the thing that we never talk about, because politics apparently is forbidden, companies unintentionally impact and sometimes directly influence society. So when we talk about how social media is breaking the fabric of society, that basically. So I want to start by focusing a little bit on companies as a legal entity, because I think a lot of things actually follow from there. So as we were saying, if you look at the Companies Act, it's quite interesting. It highlights the legal obligations of the representatives of a company. And when you look at how the Act gets enforced as well, you start to infer what a company actually is. And a company basically exists to promote success for shareholders, considering wider impacts. Again, this is for the UK. So promote success here means there needs to be a return on the investment. Shareholders are investing money in a company and they expect to see either a growth in the value of the company or dividends, some kind of like hard money returns. And they also expect to see a longer term economic sustainability of the company because the expectation is the company will continue to grow in value and give dividends and monetary value to shareholders. And in terms of the wider impact, what are these wider impacts which are guardrails within which the company needs to operate? It's employees, suppliers, the interests of customers. So these are just guardrails. It's the environment and community to make sure that there isn't undue damage done to either. And there's a bunch of various other factors as well. So this is primarily where we exist. All of the work that we do day in, day out to build and maintain, run the services, the products and services, to build revenue, to result in profits so that there's longer term viability for the company, all of that is to promote success for shareholders. That's the through line from the work that we do to the actual outcome. And this is why our jobs exist. It's not to serve customers as the end goal. It's not to serve a mission as the end goal. There is a belief, especially these days, like in modern business management, that actually if you serve customers, if you serve employees, you will also end up promoting success for shareholders. But that is not the point. The point is to ultimately promote success for shareholders. So to promote success for shareholders, we need to be productive, you and I, all of us here as employees, and therefore, how we're productive is that our companies meet our needs because they know that if they're meeting our needs, we will be more productive. And the prevailing theories at the moment are that we will be productive and our needs will be met if our intrinsic motivators are tapped into and if companies start to leverage concepts from psychology and sociology. And if this is starting to sound a little bit cynical, I need to remind you, even the thought leaders acknowledge this. So whether you listen to Simon Sinek, who talks a lot about purpose-driven leadership, or Peter Drucker, who said the actual purpose of a company should be to find a customer, not to pursue profit, all of these folks absolutely advocate for a better balance between shareholder return, customers, employees and society's needs, but they're still advocating for a balance within an economic system where profitability is the goal. They're not saying that companies should not be profitable and they should just focus on meeting needs of customers and of employees. So it's worth bearing that in mind. They are not talking about a revolution. That would be a great talk for another conference, but that is not what we are talking about. We're talking about how can we make the best of the situation that we're in. That is fundamentally what all of us are actually doing day to day in our work. So companies exist to promote success for shareholders, considering these wider impacts. At least in the UK, though, we actually have this wider impacts guardrail. So there's still some kind of focus on us and our needs as employees. And this is the second way in which we come into the picture in terms of how our companies look at us. We are a wider impact. So some of the things that are worth talking about in terms of how we put constraints around our companies is that we demand things. We demand things like sanitary bathrooms, reasonable work hours. These are all considerations that need to be balanced against the drive for the return for shareholders. And over the years, there have been riots, there's been industrial action, and laws have been passed to make sure that our fundamental needs are met. And again, a lot of these things we don't actually talk about at conferences like this because these are no-brainers. The hard work has already been has been done so that we don't have to fight for this anymore, at least for us as privileged so-called white-collar office workers in tech. If you look at our colleagues who are working in factories, they have a very different experience, even here in the UK. So we are speaking from a point of privilege. It's worth kind of acknowledging. So from our company's perspective, we as employees kind of promote success for shareholders while creating constraints for the company, right? And again, you might say, Neha, this sounds very cynical. I work with incredible managers, really kind people. They really do want the best for us. And I have no doubt that that's the case. But what I would suggest is that being realistic is not the same as being cynical. Sometimes we conflate the two. And unfortunately, that sets us down a road where we don't see the world for what it actually is. And in fact, for those of you who were at Kerry's talk yesterday, she spoke about how the Stoics actually start with what is. Not by looking at a moral lens of what things should be, but start by understanding what is. So we tend to understand the world through the lenses of how we think the world ought to be. At least for those of you who, like me, did not study philosophy. For those of you who did study philosophy, I'm incredibly envious because you probably suffered a hell of a lot less heartache than I have. So let's talk a little bit about morality, value judgments, and ideologies, because we've all got these shaping our lenses of how we think the world should work. So if we think about morality, like imagine there have been some layoffs, like with my friend Thea. People might say something like, the layoff process was really unjust because it lacked transparency. There might be a value judgment that someone shares saying, we should be really customer obsessed. It's the right thing to do. And you might have ideologies like meritocracy, where we believe that people should be promoted based on the quality of their work and not the relationship with their manager, let's say. And that's all well and good. These are very nice aspirations to have, but they don't help us understand the world for what it is. So what if we actually understood the world based on what it fundamentally, materially is? We might look at these things a bit differently. So instead of looking at things through a moral, value judgment, ideological lens, we might say, actually, the layoff process was unjust because it lacked transparency, but what does that actually mean? It means that 20 people were laid off on Tuesday. They were told by their HR rep. They were not given reasons apart from budget cuts, and there was no opportunity to speak to managers because the managers had organised an offsite for that very same week. And then when we start to unpack that a little bit, we start to go, okay, these are facts. Let's unpack those facts a little bit more and understand the why. What actually resulted in these things happening? Turns out that maybe the HR managers weren't trained on having difficult conversations. Maybe the managers felt guilty about the fact that their staff were being laid off, so they wanted to avoid the awkward situation. This is where we start to get into the reality, which is that we are humans and we are not sometimes good at dealing with discomfort. If we look at value judgments, instead of saying that we should be customer obsessed, what does that actually mean? And where does the should come from? As we start to unpack that and look at it factually, we might say, well, actually, prioritizing customer segments and tailoring our service to these segments increases engagement and retention, which in turn reduces business costs, which increases success for our shareholders. That is the fundamental reason why we think that actually we should be customer obsessed. Although, again, customer obsessed is a very creepy term. I would very much like it if we can move away from that. We've also got ideologies like meritocracy. Guaranteed, at least most of you will have been frustrated and felt like you are working in a place or have worked in a place where it hasn't felt very meritocratic. Can I just see a show of hands? Does anybody feel like there's been some kind of unfair situation around reward, whether it's around pay, promotions? Oh, yeah. Yep, exactly. Like around 75% of people, yep. So again, we could say, look, meritocracy is what the world should be or how things should work. Or you could say, well, how do promotions actually happen? And look at it factually. And we might say, well, we have company policies that value, through which you get a good performance review if you demonstrate the company values, you demonstrate performance, and you meet your personal goals. However, it's also been observed that decisions are made based on unwritten criteria, such as the employee makes the manager feel like they are doing a good job, like that they follow through on tasks without asking lots of questions. They make the jobs easier for the manager. It could be based on how friendly and collaborative that individual is, because people feel very uncomfortable disappointing nice people or people who are hardworking. It could also be whether the manager's status is at risk, that by promoting someone threatens their position, or perhaps promoting them makes them look good. This is where we start to get into the factual observational space, not just the ideology. So when we start to see the world for what it fundamentally is, rather than what it should be or ought to be, we start to actually gain insights, real-world insights that we can do something about. So being a realist actually empowers us with the truth, giving us much better options. It can be hard to acknowledge it, but once we're there, it's incredibly empowering. So what can we actually do? Like with a more realistic understanding of our company, what it means to us and what we mean to it, like we can actually start to explore some of these empowering options. So the first thing is to see the world like a realist, I would suggest. The next thing is to decide what we can actually control, influence, and accept. And lastly, we need to make our choices. We need to understand what those choices are and make them very intentionally. So let's start by, what would we see if we were realists? If we were realists, we would see some things that maybe we're not quite so clearly seeing right now. So the first thing is psychological contracts. These are the unspoken contracts that we have in every single organization. Has anybody heard of the term psychological contract? Just as a show of hands. A couple of you, fantastic, great. We would also see cultural narratives and ideologies, the things that shape our beliefs, like we've already spoken about, if we had the lens of a realist. And lastly, and this is not a canonical list, but again, another thing I think is worth talking about, we would see how there's an individualization of systemic issues. So there are things that we feel individually responsible for, even though we can't control it, and it's an entire system that needs to be looked at. So let's unpack each of these, starting with psychological contracts. These are the expectations that you and I have every single day. It's the stuff that we've held in our heads that shape our expectations of our working relationship. So our previous work experience, our life experiences, our values, all sorts of other things shape these psychological contracts. So an example is that if I don't represent my manager well in a meeting, I would kind of hope that manager tells me rather than bitching about me to somebody else. Right? That's an expectation that I have, because this person is in a position of power. I would want them to look after me, and I would want them to have my best interests in mind, and I would want them to know that I can also make them look good. So it's really important that there is that transparency and there's that openness in that relationship. And if that gets broken, I'm going to feel somewhat betrayed, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to trust my manager. That's one example of a psychological contract. It's a thing that we never wrote down because we've just implicitly expected it and believed it. And a lot of these are very reasonable. But again, it's very interesting because our employment contract is a thing we sign once and then never look at again, and it hardly shapes our work. It's the psychological contract, all of the things that we don't talk about that impact every single interaction day to day with all of our colleagues. So the first question is, do we even know what our psychological contract is? Do we expect to be given a reasonable, a clear reason for being fired, if we're fired, for example? Do our managers know that we have these expectations? How do we make sure that people are able to meet expectations? Are these implicit? Have we made them explicit? And are they balanced and reasonable? Because perhaps it's not a reasonable or a balanced contract, and it's a thing that needs to be rebalanced, because you might have a great culture, but all of us are going through situations at the moment where budgets are being cut, whether you're in the public sector and there's been a mandate to decrease spending, whether you're in the private sector and actually there have been huge layoffs. Either case, we are all experiencing the same budgetary pressures, and that is having an impact on culture. There are a lot of things that we would be able to do in the past, whether it's little things like a team lunch, for example, that aren't happening. There are lots of directives that are coming down now, and we're not being given as much autonomy in a lot of organizations because there's a lot of pressure and stress that's being felt by senior execs. That is changing our culture. So our psychological contracts change because of the context that we're in as well. So it's really important to be able to have these explicit conversations around these and figure out, are we still on the right track? So here are some examples, some really common examples of where the contract gets broken in my experience. I'd love to start with not being paid for the work. I have seen this especially in the public sector, but it's across both private and public sector. If you're a new employee, you tend to sort of get paid for the work that you've come in to do. But if you're an existing employee, oftentimes you need to demonstrate the role before you actually get given the pay rise. Yep, I'm seeing loads of people nod. Yeah, that's a breaking of the contract, right? and it's an unfair relationship. No reward for going above and beyond. My friend Thea experienced this loads towards the end of her time at her company. Sometimes it's just something little like your company will pay for dinner because you're working long hours, whatever it is, right? We have these expectations. It'll be a pat on the back, an email from a senior exec, maybe a shout out at a town hall, but there's an expectation that there's going to be some acknowledgement. Layoffs after long-term loyalty, that's really prevalent these days. The job that I'm doing is not the one that we agreed. How many times has that happened to people? Yeah, exactly. It happens loads. And again, it happens by stealth sometimes. It starts with one task, then it starts by you being invited to a couple of meetings, then it starts by actually you're added to a distribution group, and before you realize it, you're doing a completely different role without ever having explicitly had that conversation and figured out what the impact is going to be on you or the people around you. We've also got cultural narratives and ideologies. So this is one that we've all internalized, and I'm not going to lie, this is one I really struggle with unlearning myself, that work is a moral good, that hard work is virtuous and being lazy is bad. So there are many of us who feel guilt for taking time off. In some places, there's actual social policing for slacking off. And it's expected that if you're ill, you need to turn up, especially since you're working from home. All you need to do is wrap an extra blanket around you. There's purpose-driven employment, or what's sometimes called the labour of love trap. This is incredibly prevalent in the charity sector, where your job should give you purpose and meaning. And this is often used as a justification for lower pay, longer hours, and unpaid emotional labour. I think we've all seen this with nurses in the NHS, we've seen it with teachers, but it's not just the public sector, it's also in the private sector, for people who work especially like in startups that I've seen, there's an expectation that you buy into the mission, and because you've bought into the mission, actually you're doing it for the good of the mission. There's job is identity, the thing that I experienced, where your job is you, your career success is your social worth. And layoffs not only bring an identity crisis, but the time that we invest in tying our identity to our work, and it's not to say that that's the wrong thing to do, by the way, that's perfectly fine as long as you are doing it intentionally. So for those of us who don't intentionally tie our identity to our work, we may not actually find what our actual purpose is in life, and that would be so sad. You do hear about this where there are a number of folks who've been very successful in business and they get to their deathbed and then they say, my one big regret is that I missed my kid's 3rd birthday and I didn't watch my daughter walk and, I didn't spend X amount of time with this person or I didn't help that person. What is our actual purpose? Do we have the headspace to actually explore that? And lastly, meritocracy. It's the other one that we've all quite deeply internalized, where recognition should be based on performance, and it completely ignores all of the bias, the politics, and the structural issues that actually result in people succeeding. And I think we kind of know this because we talk about people being promoted to the highest level of incompetence, for example. That's a super common phrase. But at the same time, we haven't internalized it when it comes to how we are being treated. Somehow we expect that we should still be treated in that way based on our performance. And lastly, the individualization of systemic issues. So this one is actually quite insidious. A thing that we often hear about, you're burnt out? Don't worry, try resilience. It's great. Just go speak to the company counsellor. Everything will be fine. It completely ignores the fact that you're working long hours, unfeasible timelines, there's insufficient people, and you've got reduced budgets. How many of you have been told to do more with less? Bingo! There we go. This is individualization of a systemic issue in action. It's a policy now. You need to manage your time better. How many times have I seen this, where someone is given this feedback by their manager, and actually it's that there was poor leadership focus. There were too many priorities, lots of reactive directives coming in. So what's a person to do? How do they know how they need to manage their time? It's actually about the company not having clear goals and objectives. You need to improve your communication skills. Ooh, classic gaslighting. Maybe it's actually that there are unclear roles. It's not clear what I should be communicating versus what you should be communicating. And what are the processes we should be following? Is there any good modeling? Because in a lot of organizations, all we've seen is really poor modeling of good communication. And we ignore the power dynamics. If it's expected that I, as someone who is in a delivery team, is expected to say no to the CEO, does that sound reasonable? Kind of feels like maybe I'm not in an entirely safe place in doing so. So what about the power dynamics? And what about all the nuances and meaning that we also have? You can say something and I might interpret something completely different from it. So this is a really strong theme, this individualization of systemic issues, and it's really important that we don't take on undue responsibility onto our tiny shoulders. So once we've actually looked at the world through the eyes of a realist, what we then need to figure out is what can we control, influence, and accept? Whether it's with the psychological contracts or whether it's with the processes or the culture of our companies. So in terms of control, are we doing everything that we can? It's a genuine question. Something that I've observed, certainly of myself and of other people sometimes, is that we can sometimes focus too much on other people and what they're not doing when we feel uncomfortable in our own space. So it's really important to go, whoa, 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 let's just shift the focus back to me, and am I focusing on what I actually have control over? Then we talk about influence. What can I actually influence? And in fact, do I want to influence? Let's again talk about social credit. So there's a cost to influencing. When you influence someone, you spend a bit of your social credit, like we all have a bit of social credit. It's like our reputation, and sometimes you lose a little bit of that reputation, you lose a bit of that credibility or that credit every single time you tackle a difficult issue with someone. Not necessarily always, to be fair, but it depends on the context. So you're really putting yourself out there. So you need to figure out, is it worth the cost to me? And it's not just the cost in terms of the social capital that I have, but also my emotional cost. Because in trying to influence this person or this team, it just might be too emotionally draining and it's just not worth it. And I want to save that energy for something else. But again, are we doing this intentionally? That's the question that we need to answer. And lastly, and the thing that sometimes we don't often think about, there are things that we can influence, that we can shift to a thing that we can control. So there's many times where by changing a process or changing a role description, you can bring something into your sphere of control. And that's incredibly empowering. So don't forget that that is always an option. And lastly, what do we accept? What do we need to accept? Accept that this is the reality. And acceptance does not mean that I think this is a good thing. Again, we're not applying value judgments. We're just saying, I accept that this is reality, so what am I going to do about it? And if I can't do anything, I need to accept that too. I can still think that this isn't great, but I can accept that I can't do anything about it. And it's incredibly empowering. I think earlier today, Kerry gave a talk about the worry wall. There's all sorts of things that we can do in order to accept things that we have no control or influence over. And lastly, it's to make our choices, make really intentional choices. Some of us have more choices than others, absolutely. And it's really important to recognize our privilege and the fact that we have those choices, those options. And it's not a sign of failure if you decide to exercise that option and to walk, to leave your job. Again, we seem to think that walking away is a sign of failure, but it really isn't. It's actually, if you do it intentionally, it's an incredibly empowering thing to do. So celebrate that. If you choose to stay, look at options outside of your company. There are support groups, there are whistleblowing groups, there are conferences like this, communities, right, that you can tap into to get support, to get ideas, that to actually understand that maybe there's additional options that you hadn't thought about. So there's always things that we can do. You don't have to be constrained by your company, by your organization. And lastly, even if you go in with your eyes open, knowing how painful something is going to be, it's okay to commit to it. I invested in that role as a product director. I didn't enjoy it, but I saw it through because I wanted to experience it. And I'm so glad I experienced it because now I have fundamentally unlearned that social expectation I had of myself. And that's okay. Sometimes we need to suffer to learn, right? As long as it's intentional, as long as it's not being done to you and you are an active agent in that decision. So, It's not easy. You know, I've been talking about all these things that we could potentially do. I absolutely acknowledge that it is not easy, and it's very easy to get nihilistic or cynical about a lot of these things. But honestly, if we are realistic, we can also be hopeful because we have realistic options that we can exercise. And we need to just keep doing things like coming to conferences like this, connecting with people like this, like-minded people, where we get energy, where we get ideas, and where we find ways forward. Because again, like, we're going through very difficult times, you know, people have spoken about how there's constant crises, so it's really important that together as a community, as a group of people, we find ways forward. We're not in this alone. We need to stop individualizing the systemic issues of the world. And that's it, basically, you know. I would love if you could give me some feedback, please. Feel free to scan the QR code and give me feedback. But in the meantime, does anybody have any questions or even any reflections? If you wanted to share an experience or a reflection, anything like that.
Questions have to be questions.
The gentleman over here?
Don't do that.
Thank you, really great talk, really appreciate that. My question is, do you see the same issues in, say, like companies that are more cooperative, so shared ownership? Is it the same problems that we have?
Same problem. So I work with 2 cooperatives, and actually my husband worked with one as well. We saw the same issues for a couple of reasons. So one of them was like there was still an economic driver. They still needed to be profitable, right? Like, or they still needed to be economically viable, and that created tensions internally. It really exacerbated some of the power dynamics internally. Also, with the cooperative, with one of the cooperatives, one of them had put a lot of money in. And as soon as you start to put money in, you have expectations in terms of how much power or control you have in the cooperative. So there were a bunch of things like that. So I still saw the same issues, but different flavors, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Question, I appreciate it. Next question.
Oh, in the back, we've got a question over there.
Hey, how do I prevent my self-worth being tied up with the work that I do for my company?
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
How do I prevent my self-worth being entirely tied up with the work that I do at my company?
That's a really good question. I'll tell you what I did. It may not work for you, but I'll tell you what I did. So one thing was seeing a therapist. That does wonders. You know, it helps put things in perspective in terms of like, who am I? What is it that I want from my life? It provides that reflective space. Another thing I also realized is that the amount of time and headspace something occupies tends to continue to occupy that time and headspace. And we tend to think that's the thing that's really important. So for example, you know, it's like when you have nothing to do, there might be a niggling thing like you needed to, I don't know, sign a contract or something like that, and it becomes the only thing your mind fixates upon because you've got so much time and there's nothing else occupying your time. But if you were to keep busy, like go spend time with a friend or go practice an instrument or something like that, it's out of your mind and it starts to feel less important. I think there is something about how do we fill our time, because the way in which we fill our time, at least for me, I've observed, has a relationship with what occupies my cognitive space and my energy, my emotional energy as well. So one of the things that I tried a couple of years ago was reducing my working days to 3 days a week. And that opened up a 4-day weekend for me. And it was fascinating figuring out what I would do with that time. And once I actually had some passion projects and I focused on my health, work just kind of seemed to find its own place. Because actually I had so many other things that I was emotionally, psychologically invested in. So I think there's something about playing with time as well and figuring out what actually occupies your time. And if anybody else has any suggestions that they'd like to share, I'd love to hear those as well, by the way.
In the
This is just
format
what's
of a
worked
question.
for me. Yeah.
What would you say, or what do you think when you hear someone say you need to toe the company line, especially if it's at odds with like your expectations?
Could you give me a specific example of where that's happened? You can anonymize it. You don't need to, obviously.
Yeah, sat next to my colleagues.
Oh, right. A fictional example, maybe.
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying to filter.
I guess there's different degrees of towing the company line, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
One might be there is a view that coming back to work more often would increase productivity, but you're never shown evidence that that is the case.
Yes, yes. I mean, my starting point would be to kind of acknowledge, what do you feel about it? You know, like, is your line the same as the company line, or is it not? And by virtue of you asking that question, I'm assuming your line is not the same as the company line. You might have a different view. You may have a different view on things. I think it's important to understand, like, where does that come from, and what is the cost to you of challenging that? So, yes, a lot of organizations, for example, are currently demanding that people come into the office, you know, X days a week. Something that happened at a client of mine like a year and a half ago was that actually some of the folks in the team spoke to the manager and said, actually, we'd prefer that we don't come into the office, and we'd love it if we could have a bit more flexibility, because it helps with childcare, it helps with work-life balance, with a whole bunch of other things. And actually, to be honest, transport's become so much more expensive as well. It's different. It's different in terms of our cost of living as well. And in that case, the manager agreed, fine, they wouldn't necessarily have to come in X days a week, but they did agree that they would do some solid chunks of time together where they were co-located, and they organised it so that some of the other folks in the office would be there. So at least it was visible, you know, because they understood that it was about visibility, to your point. You know, I think, like, there are ways in which, if you don't agree with what the company line is, it's first of all important to understand, are there other people who are like you, who agree? Is there a way that you can work together to figure out, is there a different thing that you can do? You know, because it's different to having to toe the company line and do the thing versus say it to other people, right? Like, you might find a different way of operating where you don't need to follow the rules. There's different rules that you can kind of agree. But yeah, it's not an easy one, especially when there's a lot of pressure from people around. But I would always say that it's really important to be really realistic about, like, try things out and have the conversations, but also be honest with yourself. You know, I think there's sometimes nothing worse than having to say a thing that makes you feel inauthentic. It's much better to not say it at all rather than say the thing that makes it feel like you're lying to yourself and to other people. I don't know if that fully addresses your question, though, sorry.
That fully brings us out of time. Thank you, Neha.
Cool.